Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how you can knit any curved edge that you like when you're doing flat knitting. This will obviously involve increases and or decreases, and the concept I'm going to show you today can be used to basically design any curve or slope. In order to follow along with this, you're going to need some knitting graph paper, some pens or pencils, and maybe a compass. As you can see here, for the knitting graph paper I bought some in the form of a book, however you can also just print your own off the internet for free. The reason you need to use knitting specific graph paper is because in reality knitting stitches are rectangles wider than they are tall rather than perfect squares. If you use normal graph paper you'll end up with a curve, but it won't be the curve that you want. Okay, so the first curve that I'm going to design is actually for a project I'm currently working on. I know that I need to fit this curve into an area that's 16 rows by 48 stitches. So the first thing I did was draw a box that's 16 rectangles high and 48 rectangles across. Depending on the size of your knitting project, this box could represent the entire width of your knitting project, or it could just represent the area where you want to add the curve. You then just need to draw the curve that you want inside this box. I personally just want to cut off the top left corner of the knitting, like so. You can use a compass to make this curve, or you can just do it freehand, like me. If you're not familiar with flat knitting charts, this box basically just represents an area of knitting. And we're going to knit it from bottom to top, and we're going to start from the bottom right corner. Because we're flat knitting, we'll be knitting back and forth. So we'll be starting on the right hand side and moving left, then going from left to right, then right to left, then left to right, and so on. Next, use a pen of a different colour and follow the outlines of the rectangles on the graph paper as close to this curve as possible. Basically, you're just drawing little steps going along the curve. And here you can see more closely what I did. In flat knitting charts, you'd normally have the odd numbers down the right hand side and the even numbers down the left. However, I just thought it'd be a lot easier to see on camera if I put all the numbers together on the left hand side next to the curve. As you can see, we have row 1 at the bottom and row 16 at the top. The odd numbers are going to represent the right side rows of this knitting, and the even numbers are going to represent the wrong side rows. Since we'll be knitting this curve in stockinette stitch, that means that the odd numbered rows are going to be knit stitches and the even numbered rows are going to be purl stitches. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then we're ready to write the pattern. So for the first row we'll be starting in the bottom right corner and we'll be going from right to left. As you can see, this is a full unbroken row and therefore it's just going to be a regular right side row. And since we're doing stockinette stitch, that just means we'll be doing knit stitches all the way across. Then for row 2 we'll be going from left to right, and again it's a full unbroken row. So this will just be a regular wrong side row. And since we're doing stockinette stitch, this will just be purl stitches all the way across. Row 3 is the same as row 1, so once again it's going to be a regular right side row of knit stitches. And it's only on row 4 where it starts to change. As you can see at the beginning of row 4 there's a little step, and this is 1 stitch wide. Therefore we need to decrease by 1 stitch at the beginning of this row. So how do we know which decrease to use? Well, if you look at this curve you can see that it's right leaning, so you'll want to use a right leaning decrease. If you don't know what's meant by right leaning decreases, basically it just means that when you're looking at the decrease from the front of the knitting, it gives the appearance of leaning to the right. And examples of right leaning decreases include K2 togs or knit 2 togethers and P2 togs or purl 2 togethers. So that's what we're going to be using today. It's not vital to use right leaning decreases, but it will just make the appearance a lot neater. If you're not familiar with some of the decreases I'm going to be using in this video, feel free to search my channel because I've got videos on all of them. So since row 4 is a wrong side row and therefore it's on the purl side, I'm going to use a P2 tug or purl 2 together. That will give me a single decrease at the beginning of the row. Then because it's the wrong side of stockinette stitch, you'll want to purl until the end of the row. Then for row 5 we'll be going back from right to left, and as you can see there's no step on this row, there's just a straight line coming up from row 4. Therefore we don't need to do any decreases, and this will just be a regular right side row, i.e. just knit stitches. Then row 6 we go from left to right, and again there's no step, there's just a straight line coming up from row 5. Therefore it's just a regular wrong side row, i.e. purl stitches. Then for row 7, going from right to left again, you can see that at the end of this row there is a step. This means we need to decrease by 1 stitch at the end of row 7. The difference here though is that we're on a right side row this time, so we're going to use a K2 tug rather than a P2 tug. So we need to knit until there's just 2 stitches left, and then do a K2 tug. The reason we need to leave 2 stitches is because a K2 tug uses 2 stitches. For row 8, going from left to right, there is not a step, so we just do a regular wrong side row of purl stitches. And then on row 9, going from right to left, there is a step, so this is going to be exactly the same as row 7. So that's knit until there's only 2 stitches left, and then K2 tug. On row 10, there's a step at the beginning of the row, so we're going to do the same as row 4, which is P2 tug and then purl until the end of the row. 11, there's no step, so that's just a regular right side row of knit stitches. And then there is a step on row 12, going from left to right, and so that's going to be the same as row 10 again, which is P2 tug and then purl until the end of the row. Row 13 has a step, and so that's going to be the same as row 9, which is knit until you've only got 2 stitches left and then K2 tug. And 14 also has a step, and that's going to be the same as row 12, which is P2 tug and then purl until the end of the row. Then for row 15, moving from right to left, you can see that the step is 2 stitches wide, and this means we need to do a double decrease. So since we're on a right side row made up of knit stitches, we're going to do a knit 3 together, or K3 tug. This decreases the number of stitches by 2 in one go. So for row 15, we need to knit until we've got 3 stitches left, and then knit those 3 stitches together. Then for row 16, working from left to right, you can see that the step is 2 stitches wide, so we need to do another double decrease. This time though, we're on a wrong side row, so we're going to do a purl 3 together, or P3 tug. So that's purl 3 stitches together, and then purl until the end of the row. And then one last thing I want to do is add either a knit stitch or a purl stitch between every decrease and the edge of the knitting. One of the reasons for this is that the edge stitch on flat knitting tends to be a bit distorted and curls over, whereas we want the decreases to look nice and neat. Also, if you want to join this curve to another piece of knitting, the seaming will be a lot easier if there's consistency along the edge. So as you can see, I'm putting a purl stitch at the beginning of the wrong side rows before a P2 tug or P3 tug. And I'm also going to have a knit stitch at the end of every right side row after the K2 tugs or the K3 tug. And that's it, the pattern for the curve is now complete. The last step that I would then do is just do a regular knit bind off. I then knitted a swatch of the curve area, not the entire chart, and you can see that the shape really mimics the shape on the graph paper. You can see the stockinette edge, which is curled over slightly, and then next to it you can see the line of decreases. Because we put the decreases the same distance from the edge every time, they line up nice and neatly. Right, so that's how to design and knit one curve. But what if you want to knit 2? Well, now I'm going to show you how to work out how to knit a semicircle. So first I draw 2 vertical lines, 30 stitches or 30 rectangles apart. I then used my compass to make a semicircle shape right in the centre. Using a differently coloured pen, you then need to follow the outline of the rectangles as close to this curve as possible. You only need to do this on one side of the semicircle. You then need to copy these lines over to the right hand side as a mirror image to make sure it's entirely symmetrical. You then need to write in the row numbers. So I'm going to do this like a traditional flat knitting chart this time, and I'm going to have number 1 at the bottom right corner. Then 2 will be on the left, 3 on the right, 4 on the left, and so on. As before, all of the odd numbered rows are going to represent the right side of the knitting, and all of the even numbered rows are going to represent the wrong side. And just like the previous example, we're going to be knitting this semicircle in stockinette stitch. Here you can see more closely what I've done. Now we're ready to write the pattern. Starting at number 1, going from right to left, you can see that this is a full row with no steps. And you can also see that rows 2, 3, 4 and 5 also don't have any steps. So for rows 1, 3 and 5 we're going to do a regular right side row of knit stitches, and for rows 2 and 4 we're going to do a regular wrong side row of purl stitches. Then for row 6 we go from left to right, and you can see that there's a step in the line, and this is 1 stitch wide. Therefore we know we need to decrease by 1 stitch at the start of this row. Now is a good time to make a note that the left side of this semicircle is right leaning, and the right side of the semicircle is left leaning. So we need to use decreases that align with that. This means that on the left we'll be using K2 togs and P2 togs, but on the right we'll be using SSKs and SSPs. SSKs are slip-slip knits, and SSPs are slip-slip purls. They're basically just the left-leaning equivalents of the K2 togs and P2 togs. So the decrease we'll be using at the start of row 6 will be a purl 2 together, because this is a right-leaning decrease, and also this is a wrong side row. We then need to just purl over to the right, and you'll see that there's another step in the line, and so we need to decrease at the end of this row as well. Because we want a left-leaning decrease this time, we'll be using an SSP, or slip-slip purl. Just like the P2 tog, this is worked over 2 stitches as well. There aren't any steps on rows 7, 8 or 9, so these rows will just be plain knit or purl rows. Then row 10 is going to be the same as row 6 because it's a wrong side row and there's a step at the beginning and at the end. So that's P2 tog, then purl until there's 2 stitches left, and then SSP. There's no step on row 11, so that's just going to be a regular knit row. And then row 12 is going to be the same as row 10 again. So that's P2 tog, purl until there's 2 stitches left, and then SSP. There are no steps on row 13, so that's going to be another knit row. And then on row 14, it's the same as row 12. So that's P2 tog, purl until there's only 2 stitches left, and then SSP. Row 15 is a little bit different because there's a step at the beginning and the end, but it is a right side row this time. So we'll be going from right to left. The first decrease therefore needs to be a left leaning decrease, and on a right side row that's an SSK, or slip-slip knit. We then need to knit across to the left hand side, and for the right leaning decrease we need to do a K2 tog, or knit 2 together. Then row 16 has a single step at the beginning and the end, so it's exactly the same as row 14, which is P2 tog, purl until there's 2 stitches left, and then SSP. Then for row 17 we go from right to left, and you can see that the steps are 2 stitches wide, one at the start and one at the end. So therefore we need to do double decreases. So for the left leaning decrease we need to do SSSK, or slip 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 knit, and for the right leaning decrease we need to do K3 tog, or knit 3 together, and in between would just be knit stitches. Then for row 18 it's the same because we have 2 more double decreases. So going from left to right, we need to do a right leaning double decrease, which will be P3 tog, or purl 3 together. And on the right we're going to do an SSSP, or slip 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 purl, as the double decrease, and in between will just be purl stitches. And finally on row 19 we have 2 steps, and these are 4 stitches wide. This means that for each step you need to go down from 5 stitches to 1. So going from right to left you need to do an SSSSK, then knit 2 stitches, and then do a K5 tog. And after that you would just bind off those last 2 stitches. Now, as in the previous example, I want to have a knit stitch or a purl stitch between every increase or decrease and the knitted edge. So everywhere I'm putting a red dot now, I'm going to put a knit stitch if it's a right side row, or a purl stitch if it's a wrong side row. You might notice that this means that for row 19 there will be no knit stitches in between the 2 decreases. And as a result I've crossed off row 19 because I just don't think it's worth the effort of doing those 2 big decreases just to leave 2 little stitches that aren't really going to change the shape. Instead I'll end on row 18 and then bind off. And here you can see the knitted result of that pattern. Just like the chart, it's 30 stitches wide at the base, and I've bound off the stitches at the top. You can see the lines of decreases on each curve and the stockinette edge stitch on the outside. And that's it, that's how you design and knit curves. I really hope that's been helpful for you, and thank you very much for watching.